Well, hello, everybody. I'm your host, Ed Parcaut, and let's bring in our guest today, Tom Equels. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you being here today.
Oh, it's a real honor, Ed. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. We don't get many Vietnam veterans, and so anytime I can have a Vietnam veteran, I'd love to have them on. It seems like they don't want to talk about their service. Or they just forgot it. You know what I mean? That's just something, because I go out of my way whenever I see a Vietnam vet. I don't care how far away they are from me. I will walk across. My wife always knows I'll walk so far to go and shake their hand and thank them for their service because how they were treated when they came back.
Well, those were rough times, and often people made a lot of sacrifices out of patriotic concepts of duty that at the time weren't very much appreciated. So that could be the reason for the reluctance.
I could see that. I mean, it was one of those situations that we were in, and there was, the news really showed all the stuff going on here, how people were, I don't want to say the riots, but those type of things, kind of like they're doing now. I won't get into that whole political stuff right now, but what they were showing, instead of showing what we were there for and what we were trying to do. But let's start the show with, what service were you in, and why did you join it, or did you get drafted? I guess
I was in the Army. I joined, and in fact, I was recruited in high school. My senior year, a group of Army aviators came, and I'm not sure how they selected us, but a group of several of the seniors that were set to graduate were made a part of a presentation about Army flight school programs, and it was basically if we could pass the aptitude tests and everything, which they seemed confident that we could, that we could go through. We had to go through infantry training first. I think that's so. If you flunked flight school, you went. They gave you M16 and you went right to Vietnam. But that's how I joined the Army, and it was specifically for the purpose of attending what was called Warrant Officer Flight Training, which was a program that I think where they were making aviators warrant officers during that period of time without the requirement of a college education, so that they could find helicopter pilots for what has rapidly turned into an air mobile military concept that required a lot of pilots.
And plus, they didn't have as much invested with you when you went down. The other side of that, I interviewed another guy who was a helicopter pilot during Vietnam, and he was talking about that, how often they would go down and how they were shot, and how, those other things. I think he wrote a couple books about them too. But it was that was not a safe vehicle to be in. I mean, people shot at you a lot.
Oh, it was very dangerous. I flew Cobra gunships, which when I would go out on missions, we almost always got shot at because we were shooting things. I mean, the whole reason they sent us was, to provide fire support or attack some kind of military target, tanks, trucks, whatever that they'd identified. So I had about 300 combat missions, a little more than 300 actually, in the course of a year, and a lot of it involved hostile fire.
Where particular were you stationed at?
I principally was working out of what was called Marble Mountain Army Airfield, which is near Da Nang. But then there was an offensive. It was called the Spring Offensive of 1972, when 5 divisions of North Vietnamese came south and from across the DMZ and in from Laos. And so the battle went forward very aggressively, and we just sort of moved to places close to the front lines so that we didn't have to, be constantly going back to Marble Mountain for, we would move ammunition, fuel, and everything up close. And of course, every so often we would go back to our airfield.
Wow. Yeah. My dad was in the Air Force, and he worked on planes as a mechanic, and he died of hairy cell leukemia when I was 12 because of all the planes that he worked on that was dropping all the Agent Orange.
Mhm.
So everybody I know was in Vietnam on my parents' side, and everybody. So it's just amazing that how many people were in it, and I didn't realize why so many people were in the Air Force. Pulled into the Air Force, but then you remember, but when 1950 something, that's when they moved the air wing off from the Army, right? So around that time.
Yeah, strategic bombers and certain
Yeah.
types of aircraft went from the Army Air Corps to the Air Force. But the Army still maintained a lot of the close air support, almost all of the helicopters that worked in Vietnam were Army helicopters. Well, there were Navy and Air Force helicopters, of course, but the vast majority were Army helicopters. And the the way things worked then, helicopters became more and more a part of everyday military operations, from delivering supplies to moving troops around and that kind of thing. So that war became the war that established the helicopter as a part of our tactical and strategic plan.
And plus, people don't realize the Army is the largest force. I mean, it is huge compared to all the other three forces.
Well, I'm not sure about it today, but that's the way it was then.
It still is. It still is today. Yeah. My son's in the Army. Currently, he's an airborne medic. Actually, he just dropped that. Now he's just a medic. But he, yeah, I was wondering why the Army made ranks so fast and all this stuff today anyway. And I researched all that. And it's like, because it's one of the largest forces still compared to the other three. Yeah. All right. So how long were you in Vietnam?
1 year.
And how long were you in the service?
6 years.
So after that 1 year you're in Vietnam, you came back, you were still flying helicopters, or was there?
Yeah. I got to Vietnam in January of 1972, towards the end of January, I think it was. Things are a little bit blurry because that was a long time ago.
I know. Don't worry about that. Don't not get an exact date. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to research it.
But but it is a long time ago. But anyway, so I got there, I think, at the very end of January of 72 and left in January of 73.
There was a huge offensive with a ton of helicopters. Was that in 72 and 73, or was that before?
That was the spring offensive of 1972. It commenced at the very first part of April of 1972, and I was very involved in that. And in fact, I got my first Distinguished Flying Cross during the initial days of that offensive. There were a huge number of North Vietnamese troops that came across the border, and it was very active combat for months.
And so what was that offensive? Because a lot of people don't know about it. So would you mind explaining just a little bit about it? And don't worry, I got plenty of time to talk about your book, everything else. But I think people don't really remember Vietnam. And I want them to understand, especially at the tail end there, what we did. Vietnam and Afghanistan at the end is so dissimilar, it's ridiculous. And what I mean is the withdrawal and the mess.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it. My book, the protagonist is a Marine recon officer that was in Vietnam, which is different from what I'm going to explain to you. But when I got to Vietnam in January, I spent about 2 weeks in this transition, barracks thing where they're trying to figure out where they're going to put you. And then sometime in February, I arrived at Marble Mountain Army Airfield, which is just outside of Da Nang in the northern part of what was then South Vietnam. And there was really nothing going on. And the air base was right on a beach. And I grew up in, Florida. So, I was surfing and, getting a good tan and flying a couple missions a week. And it was, I was thinking to myself, this is nowhere near as bad as I thought it was. But then, about, a month and a half, 2 months later, we started seeing signals of a buildup of the North Vietnamese forces massing. And there was a really bad weather system that moved in on Easter Day. and that's when they came across the border in a very massive invasion involving probably 50,000 North Vietnamese troops coming down from the north. And there was at least a division coming in from Laos, back over near where Khe Sanh used to be.
And so yeah, I just kind of just quickly explain what you were involved with and what you did during that.
Well, I was there at the very beginning of it because our unit, it was the 48th Assault Helicopter Company. We were assigned as a part of a light fire team. I was a co-pilot at that point in time because I was 19 years old and a junior warrant officer, and I'd been. This was probably my first real combat mission. I mean, we had missions, but nothing like this. And so we were doing what was called recon by fire because the weather was very bad, and a lot of the traditional methods of reconnaissance. And remember, we're talking about a time when you didn't have satellite imagery and the things that we use now to identify where an enemy is.
People had antennas on their TV back then.
That's right.
And you actually had to get up and tell your kid to walk over and turn the channel for you. And there was only 3 channels at that time. So,
well, some months later, when I was the pilot of the helicopter, not the co-pilot, I had to listen to a lot of guff from the maintenance officer because we were flying low level, and I came back with part of an antenna in the gun turret. So I'm assuming it wasn't for a TV, probably for somebody's radio, but
right.
But the battle didn't start right then because we weren't allowed to shoot unless we were shot at, and they didn't shoot at us, so we were just reporting on who they were, where they were moving, and all that. But then within probably the second or third mission that day, back out towards where the invasion was taking place, then it turned into a shooting war. Wow. I'm not sure who started that. Yeah.
So at the time, the engagement was you don't shoot them unless they shot at you first.
There were rules of engagement that said that. And then additionally, when you're doing a reconnaissance, that's an intelligence mission. Right. So, if you're shooting at people, you're not gathering information about where other people are, where the tanks, where the trucks, where the troop columns. So our job was not to engage, even if there had been no rules of engagement.
Right. You're trying to be there secretively to get the information of whatever, and then, you can go from there.
Yeah.
That must have been a little surreal for you, especially being the age you were, going through that. I mean, people today at 18 and 19 can't make a decision on certain things, and you're in a war at that time.
Well, I'm very grateful I was 19 because I'm 72 now, and if I did that now, I'd probably have a heart attack. When I say it was very exciting, I don't necessarily mean in a good way, but but you're right. The people that I worked with and flew with had great responsibility on their shoulders, and many of us were very young. I was probably one of the youngest, but still, the people who'd been there for 2 tours were in their 20s. So and you had to make decisions, sometimes life and death decisions, especially as you progress to more areas of more responsibility as pilot in command or aircraft commander, or sometimes leading missions.
Wow. And when you came back from, so you said that mission was when you got your first cross. Is that what you said?
Well, the first mission I was talking about is when the offensive first started. That's not when I got my first distinguished flying cross. That was about 2 days later, maybe 3 days later. There was a fire base that had a CIA listening station, and there were a group of recon Marines there, and I don't know, probably 500 South Vietnamese. I think they were South Vietnamese Army troops, and it was surrounded by about 5,000 North Vietnamese troops. It's called Camp Carroll. The siege of Camp Carroll was sort of documented a number of times, as a part of military history. But when we got a call that the camp was being overrun, and we happened to be nearby, and there was a Chinook that was coming up to take out the survivors. Chinook's a big transport helicopter with 2 rotors. So we volunteered to come in as gun escort for the Chinook. And so we came down, to where the loading, there's like a landing pad there. And there was a lot of fire going on because, when you have thousands of North Vietnamese troops, just the AK-47 fire was withering because, it's a lot of people shooting an AK-47. And then they had machine guns and things like that. And they were also shooting mortars in. But we came down on each side of the Chinook. And my job was, as the co-pilot, I was also in charge of the turret weapons. So I was firing with what's called the minigun, to suppress the enemy fire and give time for the Chinook to get loaded and get out. And it was definitely a serious combat mission in the sense that, that aircraft had, I think, 50 some rounds that had hit the aircraft. So, wow. It was fairly badly damaged by the time we got back and were able to replace it with another helicopter.
Amazing how many helicopters they must have had. There went through, you know what I mean?
Well, it was interesting. The aircraft commander that I was flying with that day he lives in near the Army Aviation Center. He was an instructor pilot till he retired. His name is Al Miller, and Al was not real tall, so we called him Big Al, of course. That's the nature of things. But Al was a ferocious gunship pilot, and he reminded me when we were talking. We have some reunion groups and stuff. That day we went through 3 helicopters. We had 2 that were shot down. They weren't crashed. They just couldn't fly anymore. And we landed, got picked up, went back, got another one. It got so combat damaged. We made it, almost all the way back to, our base and had to get picked up there because it couldn't fly anymore. And then the last one we landed that night with a hydraulic failure on the runway at running landing on the runway at Marble Mountain Army Airfield. And so that was probably the longest day of flying I'll ever have, because it started very early in the morning and it was very exciting, of course.
Now, did anybody write any books, or has there been a movie or anything about that event? Yeah,
there's a movie called Bat 21 that you might have seen. I think there are some books about the Camp Carroll rescue. But the spring offensive, it has been the topic of literature for sure.
Yeah, but I don't think people know about it. I mean, really, people don't know about anything these days. Their history is not taught anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be political. It's not, we need to know our history. We need to know what we've been through so we don't repeat certain things.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. All right. So from all this fun you had while you were there, when you came, so you were in for 6 years. So you left, you were here for a year, you went back, and what did you do for the next 5 years?
Well,
or 4?
Well, it's 4 years. The flight training was a little bit over a year, maybe 18 months. Then I was a year in Vietnam. And then when I came back, I don't know if you recall, in 1973, in January of 1973 is when the treaty was signed where the American forces withdrew. Mm-hmm. So within a month or 2 of that, everybody was out. And I'm not sure why this was, but the Army was doing what was called a reduction in force. So, they didn't need thousands of helicopter pilots and, that kind of thing. So almost everybody I knew, either got out completely or went into reserve units, National Guard units. But they had asked me to stay in and become an instructor pilot at the Army Aviation Center, which I did. And I also was what's called a project officer for Training and Doctrine Command, and worked on a number of innovative technical training improvements related to flight simulation. In fact, I'm co-author of an article that was just published in Army Aviation Magazine, July issue, going over the history of Army aviation training simulation and how we moved from just a very basic, almost useless type of training devices up into the early 70s to highly advanced computer-driven digital image generated flight simulation. And so I did that, and also helped co-write what ultimately became a manual. We did a book called Helicopter Gunship Tactics in a High Threat Environment. And my feeling is that may have been, I'm not sure, it's like there are some things in life you never know why they ask, because, and the Army's one of them. Nobody tells you. They said, but they didn't ask me to leave, which meant I had to stay because I had a 6-year commitment. And so I helped write that book as well.
Wow. What was the name of that book again?
Well, the manuscript was called Helicopter Gunship Tactics in a High Threat Environment. The field manual, I don't remember the number, but it was like became one of the standard gunship tactic field manuals a few years later.
Did they have is it dunker training where they have you go upside down in water and all that stuff back then?
No, we didn't do that. That's just now.
That's the new stuff then, huh?
Well, the problem with the Cobra is you couldn't jump out of the Cobra if you wanted to. It's like, you've got a canopy like a jet fighter that goes over the top, but the rotor blades are spinning around up here. So, you land and get out. Now, if you're in the water, I guess you probably, if you were a Navy helicopter pilot, you probably would go through that.
Right.
But the Army, we typically had as little to do with water as possible.
Right. And people realize in Vietnam it was rice paddies, right? More than anything else, or was it?
Well, where I was very mountainous, a lot of valleys and uplands. And then there was a coastal plain, but probably within 25 miles of the coast, you were in the mountains.
Wow. All right. So when you separated, what year was that from the military?
It would have been 1976.
When you got out, did you have a plan at the time, or you were just like, I'm done, I don't want to do this? Did you fly helicopters when you got out? What did you do when you got out?
No, I didn't. I unlike some people, I always have a plan.
Sometimes people don't know they're getting out. They're told they're getting out, or they had a medical thing. So, and sometimes people have a plan and it doesn't always work. So.
Well, I did have some medical issues that were problematic because I crushed this part of my sinus area here, and I kept getting these infections, and ultimately had to have several surgeries and stuff. But I also, while I was doing the instructor pilot and TRADOC job, I was going to the university full time. Troy University had a campus right on the aviation center. Its main campus was maybe 20 miles away. And so I got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree. And when I finished up my master's degree, I had finished my term of service and elected not to stay in, and returned and went to law school.
Right. And how long were you a lawyer? Practicing law, I should say.
Let's see. I graduated from law school in 1980, and I practiced law until, I guess it would be 2014, 2015.
Wow. You did it a while.
Yeah.
And what did you specialize in?
Business litigation, international relations. I represented the government of Panama after we went in with the new government after Noriega, post invasion, and worked in for I don't know, at least 10 years, where a lot of the work I was doing was related to helping the government, one, get Noriega prosecuted, and two, recover a lot of the money that had been laundered and moved into different places around the world.
How did you get into that job? I mean, that's a let's go yellow page book. Tom, we're an attorney. How are we going to hire somebody? I mean, how do you become that person? You must have had some amazing cases up to that point to where they knew that you could handle that.
Well, I think it was a matter of I did have some successful. I was an honor. I graduated with high honors from law school and all that, and I was summa cum laude in my undergraduate work. So academically, I guess I was qualified, but a lot of times things like that are because of people and that you've worked with before, and as a result, they entrusted me with being able to help in that process of bringing in the new government and having as peaceful change and transition of power as we could muster at the time.
Wow. All right. So you were attorney for that long. And then, so most people through Vietnam never talked about PTSD. I assume you had PTSD because we're here. One of the things we're here to talk about is your book, The Horseman Tale.
Well, I may have had PTSD. I've never, but the character in the book has PTSD, and
This is the book. If you're watching, this is the book. If you're on, it's The Horseman Tale. If you're listening,
show that again. That's a very sexy book cover there.
Yeah, it's a good cover.
Anyway, the protagonist is a Marine, and he does have PTSD, and he uses Veterans Administration therapy for that PTSD called journaling therapy or written exposure therapy. So the plot of the book is based, around a triggering event which causes him to journal, and then he goes through a lot of the things that may contribute to the PTSD, but also that are important parts of his life and drive the plot forward. And that is, he's some of this may sound like it's personal, but we write from experience. So he's an old man, he's sitting in his recliner watching the news, and one of these Camp Lejeune commercials comes on, and he realizes when he sees that commercial, the law firm commercial, that when he got back from Vietnam, he was assigned as a training officer at Camp Lejeune, and he brought his wife and his young son with him. His wife became pregnant while there, but they lost their second baby due to birth defects, and she ended up having Parkinson's disease, and then eventually had died just a year or so earlier of liver cancer, all of which are related to the water contamination at Camp Lejeune. So that was the structure for the plot of the book that I used, and the PTSD is a good device to allow the character to sort of peel the psychological onion of what it's like to have been in a war and deal with these stresses and the fears and the violence and the things that you wouldn't talk about to another person. You might not share with anybody, but you can share in this journal with yourself. So when you see this character, Jake Montgomery, he's a retired Marine Corps colonel, sort of, opening up and talking about everything he did and what he felt. He's only doing that in it's like a diary, for himself. So that was the structure I used to be able to tell the story.
How did you get into writing books?
Well, I've always been a writer. One of the articles I wrote for Army Aviation Digest in 1976 won Best Article of the Year award. And as I as I mentioned, I was working in this TRADOC group on the manuscript for the helicopter gunship tactics in a high threat environment. This is basically tank warfare using helicopters to fight tanks, because there was a big threat at that time. The Russians had maybe like 10,000 tanks poised to invade Europe through the Fulda Gap. So it was about what tactics we could use to blunt that, because they probably had a 10-to-1 superiority in numbers to us in tanks. And over the years, I've written numerous articles. For example, I wrote an article called "Interview with a Dictator," which the law review, there was a law review, I think it was the University of Massachusetts, had asked me to write about working to bring in Noriega and track down all of his money. So if you like that kind of a little bit of it is cloak and dagger, because it involves BCCI and Osama bin Laden and his funding, his hidden funding channels. There were a lot of things that got uncovered in the course of that, so the opportunity to talk about what a person who's had some of these same experiences in a different context, was something I thought was valuable, because, like you say, a lot of Vietnam veterans don't talk about what it was like, so you don't know, and partly, and wrongly, I think, is they feel a certain ashamed or reluctance because of the way they were treated at that point in time. Instead of their service being respected, it was at best dismissive and at worst, very antagonistic. So I'm trying to tell this man's story in a way where people can have some insight as to what it was like to serve in Vietnam and to have a career in the military.
Well, and what do you want people to take away from this book?
Well, this book operates on many levels, and one of the concepts that is built into this book is the idea that we need to learn how to accept who we are. Part of the stressors that contribute to his PTSD is that there are things about his life that he's hidden from others. He even hides from himself. And as that opens up, it frees him to forgive himself. Now, that's a psychological part of the plot that is a constant part of the storyline. But it's really about acceptance and reconciliation, so that you can reach a place where you're at peace. So many times we see veterans who are angry and, frustrated and wound up. A lot of times that's just because they haven't been able to come to peace with themselves. It's very hard to love others if you can't love yourself. It's very hard to forgive others if you can't forgive yourself. So that's a part of this book that is important. But another part of this book that I think is of critical importance is the idea that, we, most people who were in the military, were there for good reasons and good, rationales, and that a way that, is problematic for many is that when you got out of the military, I'm very grateful I didn't get out immediately, because, you come from, 3-4 combat missions a day where you're shooting people and all that, and to just be put out on the street is, and that's the way it was for a lot of people. So having that 4 or 5 years for me to decompress and transition was very important. But not everybody had that opportunity, and learning how, to be a success, in your role post-war is very, very important. so many lives have been lost. And when I say lives have been lost, in a way, they died as a casualty of Vietnam because psychologically there was no path for them, to have a life that they could live with. The number of suicides and fatal accidents and things like that occur with veterans is very, very high. And I try to get to the essence of that too, because once we learn to accept who we are and be open to that and forgive those things in ourselves, then we start to see that we can relax and have our place in this world. I hope that makes sense, because
it totally made sense to me. Totally. I don't know about everybody else, but it made sense to me. But people don't realize it's like 50 a day is committing suicide for whether, I don't care what you call how it happens. The Veterans Administration is not counting the numbers because there's certain reasons they don't count. But I'm just saying the number everybody would know is 22 a day. I talked about that last year as president of my Rotary. And by the end of the year, after having somebody come in and talk about, because my whole year of president of my Rotary was to help vets and get the community more aware of the veterans' need. And it's like 50 a day. So it's huge.
I mean, it's a problem that, time obviously reduces the incidence, because more people are gone, and but there aren't that many Vietnam veterans like you say right now, and as Vietnam veterans go, I'm probably as young a Vietnam veteran as you're going to see, because I was there at the very end of the American involvement, and I turned 20 years old that year. So, right. Most of the people that I know that served in Vietnam are, like at this point in their 80s. So, and many didn't survive. A lot of the people I flew with died in accidents and things like that. And in a way, the combat and the effects of combat may not be a suicide, but when you see people that, drive off the road at 110 miles an hour, half drunk in a pickup truck, that may be an accident, but it's an accident fueled by, the demons that aren't tamed and haven't been exorcised.
Wow. Tom, thank you for much coming on the show today. Really appreciate you being here and talking about your book and your history that you've had especially your time in Vietnam. A lot of people don't talk about that or want to talk. We talk about that. Veterans just don't want to talk. And I think everybody should talk about, so people will, one, it can help you and it can help other people understand what we've been through.
Well, if you get a chance to go on the internet and go to thehorsemanstale.com, the name of the book is The Horseman's Tale. And I think if you have an interest in understanding more about these topics, the book is a very good read. It's exciting. And I think extremely meaningful.
And I'll have that in the show notes if you missed it, so don't worry. Okay. All right, Tom, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you being here.
Well, I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to be on your show, and thank you for all the good work you do. I've watched a few of the podcasts, and it's very important.
Thank you.
All right.